It's a wonderful day here in the sports nutrition land because Dr. Jenkins here. Ladies and gentlemen, we are covering our first macronutrient of the semester. It's oh so exciting. So, this is going to be our next unit, kind of, right? We'll take each macronutrient in detail. So our first chapter here is carbohydrates. Next week we'll do fat, and the following week we will do protein. Make sure that you are putting enough time aside for studying, because we are going to get more in depth than we have before. Here's an outline. We'll tend to follow a similar structure with each nutrient, all right? Okay, so here we go. As has been the case, most important stuff is either already in red or I'm going to circle it in red for you. So we already know that carbohydrates, we have two main structural types. There are our simple sugars, which are our mono, which is one sugar, and di, which are two sugars. And then we have complex sugars, which are polysaccharides, which are three or more sugars, right? Now, you'll see in each chapter, I'm going to have a picture of what the actual molecule looks like. But you don't need to know this. I just like to have a visual so you can see, for example, glucose kind of has as a molecule a hexagon stop sign kind of shape. It is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You don't need to know that necessarily, but just know here we have simple and complex. Here's our review. Our monosaccharides are one sugars. Glucose is an example. Glucose is what circulates in our bloodstream. Fructose is also a type of monosaccharide. And we're going to talk about that because we will see it in some sports nutrition related things. We have our disaccharides, which are still simple sugars, right? These two up here are simple. Two sugars. An example is sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar. And then also we have lactose, which is found in milk and dairy products. And then, of course, our complex carbs are the polysaccharides, three or more. And we have our three examples. Starch, found in potatoes, pasta. Fiber, found in like granola and grains. And glycogen, which is our form of stored glucose. So you should know what has stars in front of them. Here we go. So monosaccharide, one sugar. Each one of these examples is just one little hexagon shape, right? What's important about glucose as a monosaccharide, this is what circulates in our blood. If our muscles need quick sugar, boom, they're going to steal some glucose from the blood. This is a great, quick energy source. We have a lot of it, glucose. Glucose is what is found in Gatorade. So if we need to hydrate, replenish carbohydrates quickly, we might as well ingest it in monosaccharide form. Because if we ingest it right as glucose, we don't even have to break it down. Our body can just pretty much absorb it right away, and it will get to the cells the quickest. Fructose. Fructose is something that we find naturally in fruits. So, I don't know about you, but back in the day when I was younger, I played soccer. Halftime, one of the moms or one of the parents or one of the whatever would bring some orange slices. Great little way to bring in some glucose or some monosaccharides when needed. But fructose is that type of monosaccharide. Galactose is the other monosaccharide that you don't need to know about. So be able to give an example, right? Glucose is our blood sugar found in Gatorade. Fructose is also a monosaccharide, and it's what we find kind of as a natural sweetener, for example, in fruits. Glucose is so important, by the way, even if we bring in a different type of sugar. What if we bring in a disaccharide or a polysaccharide? We eventually break everything back down into glucose. Even if we bring in a polysaccharide, it gets broken down. mechanical digestion, chemical digestion. And we always want to break carbohydrates down into their simplest form, smallest form, which is glucose. So glucose is very important. Here are some other examples of where we would find glucose. A lot of energy gels have glucose. Fructose can also be found in energy gels. Oftentimes fructose is more palatable, and what that means is it tastes better. So fructose can be found in fruits naturally, but it can also be added to things like an energy gel because it's sweeter, makes it taste good. These monosaccharides are the quickest to break down. We're going to talk about this later in this chapter, but when this would be appropriate for some athletes would be right before, not long before, right before activity and during activity, but not during every activity. Activity where you're exercising for at least 45 to 60 minutes continuously. We're going to talk about that more later. All right, disaccharides are two examples that we introduced. One was sucrose, and that's table sugar. Not only do we add this to our coffee, or maybe you add it to fruit if you're making a pie or a jam or something. It also occurs naturally in foods. And then lactose is our form of disaccharide that's found in milk and dairy. Just be able to identify those two as disaccharides and that they are found in table sugar and then milk for lactose. Here are some other examples in sports nutrition. Similar to the monosaccharides, they'd want to be ingested in similar situations. So the mono and di we kind of group together because they're both quite simple. Lactose, we know that chocolate milk in the right instance can be a decent recovery drink. Sucrose, boy, they add that to a lot of things, right? That's the table sugar. Look at a Cliff Bar, so much sugar, probably more than we need, right? And maltose. So I want to point out maltose. Maltose, you might also see listed as maltodextrin. Really popular, right? And this is a combination of maltose, a disaccharide, and glucose. All you need to know about these two is that they're kind of the same thing, very similar. And these are simple sugars. But you might see on the back of a nutrition label maltodextrin, and you might think, what the heck's that? It's a type of simple sugar. Combination of things put together, but still simple sugar. Here we go. I was already thinking about this, right? So this is an old label, but still, okay. Black cherry almond, I just picked one that I could find online, easiest. Let's first look at the sugar. 44 grams of sugar. Wow, that's a lot. So we look at the ingredient list. We already know from an earlier chapter that what is listed first on the ingredient list is what is present in highest amounts. So I love how they do this. Organic brown rice syrup. They kind of throw in organic and you might think, oh, it's healthier. Not really. Organic brown rice syrup is maltodextrose, similar maltodextrose, maltose, and glucose. Sugar, sugar, and sugar. They tend to be simpler sugars. Simple sugars. And then as you read further down the ingredient list, we're going to eventually find more sugar. Let's see. Cane juice, that's sugar. Evaporated cane juice, that's sugar. So a bunch of sugar in there. I'm not going to ask any details about this. This is just an example, folks. All right. When we talk about carbohydrates, particularly our simple sugars, mono and disaccharides, we immediately think of energy, right? This is what our cells go to first. We tend to focus on our muscle cells, but it's other cells also. So if a cell needs energy, the first thing it's going to go to is a simple sugar. It's going to go to that blood glucose. Okay. Something else I didn't mention before, I don't think, but I really want to point out now. The central nervous system, that is your brain and spinal cord. The cells of your brain can only burn carbohydrates for fuel. They cannot burn fats. Other cells in the body, muscle cells, they can burn fat. They love to burn fat. So muscle cells are ultimately almost always burning a carb-fat mixture for fuel. But the brain, the central nervous system, can only burn carbs. Important. For example, if we think about athletes who do some kind of fasting or intermittent fasting, that could certainly interrupt this. Or someone trying a low carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic diet, very low carbs, high fat. I'll discuss this later in the semester. I am not a particular fan of the ketogenic diet, particularly for athletes, because carbohydrates are such an important fuel source. But a second reason why is because our brain and spinal cord, they can only use carbohydrates. All right. Something else that we're going to be talking about, when you have enough carbohydrates, it says here sufficient carbohydrate. When you're bringing in enough carbohydrates, that means you're able to quote unquote spare protein. So this is a good thing. When we bring in enough carbohydrates, I'm not talking about too much necessarily. Too many carbs can have negative side effects, but if we bring in a proper amount of carbs, if we bring in enough, if we're not too low, then our body doesn't have to turn to protein for energy as much. So we can spare protein and use protein for what it's really designed for. Structure, forming chemicals. So you should know all three of those things as functions in red. All right. So we just covered the simple sugars, mono and disaccharides. Let's now move into the complex carbs, which of course would be the polysaccharides. 3 examples of polysaccharides: glycogen, starch, and fiber. As you can see from these pictures, there are little stop sign hexagon shapes, but there's one after another, after another. So there's just so many, these long chains, many together. Glycogen, here we go. Glycogen, it's not commonly found in foods. It is the storage form of sugar in plants, but it's not commonly found in foods. For us, stored glucose. This is where we store our glucose. Glycogen is stored glucose. We talked about this in Module 3. 2/3 of our glycogen is stored in skeletal muscles. Review that. And 1/3 of our glycogen is stored in the liver. I'll remind you, when we have a meal and we bring in all of a sudden a lot of carbs, we break the carbs down, we absorb them. But we don't need all that blood sugar in the blood all at once. You have a big bowl of pasta, great, but we don't need all that broken down sugar in the bloodstream at once. So what your liver does is your liver will make the decision. It will keep some glucose in the blood, so you have a little bit of glucose in the blood, but it stores the rest as glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscles. So we have stored glucose on the shelf. And what this also means is, if you don't eat for a couple hours, you're going to be just fine. If you don't eat for a couple of hours, your body will just go to the liver, go to the skeletal muscles, break down the glycogen back into glucose. Perfect. Starch. Oh, I accidentally, and I apologize, I made a mistake. I said that glycogen was the stored form of glucose in plants. It's really starch, but you're not going to have to know that for this class. All right, what we need to know is starch. It's a polysaccharide, and it's found in a lot of plant-based food: grains, potatoes, rice. Grains, potatoes, rice, bread. You know what's starchy. So it's a polysaccharide found in grains, wheat, potatoes, rice, and this can also be used as an energy source. It's a polysaccharide, so it'll take a little bit longer to break down than the mono and the disaccharides, but still a good energy source. Fiber. All right, fiber is a little bit different in its chemical structure, and that difference in chemical structure means that it cannot be broken down. Therefore, fiber passes through your GI tract undigested and not absorbed. So fibers do not provide energy. Fibers provide no energy. No energy. So even though it's a polysaccharide, the function of fiber isn't to give us energy. It's to help move things through the GI tract. Helps to move things through the GI tract. So even though we don't absorb fiber as it makes its way through our GI tract, it still has a function. It's helping to push things through the GI tract, which is a good thing. There are different types of fiber, dietary, functional. You do not need to know those. Okay. What are some examples in sports nutrition of these polysaccharides? All right, glycogen, really important. We know that glycogen is our stored sugar in our body. So sometimes our muscles, if there's no immediate blood glucose, the muscles will just break down the glycogen because there's glycogen storage right in the skeletal muscles. So it can be broken down for energy. Starch. Starch is a pretty common thing in the sports nutrition world. This would not be what you would ingest right before an activity. This is what you would do a couple hours before, have some complex carbs, or the night before. Because a complex carb takes longer to break down than simple sugars, it will provide more energy. The energy will last longer, but you don't want to ingest it right before. So this type of carbohydrate, a complex carb, is best to ingest the night before an activity or several hours before an activity. Fiber, not used for energy, but it is helpful to move things through our GI tract. It's good to ingest not near a time of exercise. Should not be ingested during or after activity. So that would be fiber. You would want large amounts of fiber when you're not near an exercise session. Okay, so the complex sugar functions. If you recall, the simple sugar was what our cells went to first for energy. Simple sugar is the only fuel source that the central nervous system can use for energy. And having enough simple sugars means that we can spare protein, which means that we're not going to be burning protein for energy. We can keep protein doing what it needs to be doing. So complex sugar, of course, most of them energy source, but this is what our muscles turn to second. Our muscle cells first turn to the simple sugars. When our simple sugar supply dwindles, then our muscle cells will break down the glycogen back into glucose. So it's what our muscle cells go to second. Now, of course, both simple and complex sugars give us quicker energy than fats. You can see an interesting little point there. Glucose and glycogen together usually provide around half of all the body's energy that it needs, fuel. Pretty interesting. And of course, some fiber is good. Fiber is good to help keep things moving steadily through our GI tract. All right, here we go. I apologize there. A little fun cartoon for you. What does that say? Nuts and gum? Random. Okay, here we go. So we already know the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. Ooh, this is a type. Yeah. We already know the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. I was getting confused with my other class where we're talking about fats, but we're talking about carbohydrates. Almost everyone, athlete or not, should be getting somewhere between 45 and 65% of carbs through their diet. If you're an athlete, you'll probably be on the higher end of that. If you're a sedentary person or a diabetic, you'll probably be on the lower end. Here are some averages in grams, but I am not going to have you know those grams because it really is dependent upon your age, height, weight, and activity level. But you should know the range. Okay. Let's talk about carbohydrate storage and metabolism, basically how we use it. Well, I've already introduced this, but here we are just putting it again to make sure that we really understand. What do the muscles go to for energy? In order, the muscles will first utilize glucose from the blood, and of course that's going to fuel the phosphocreatine energy system we talked about already. Once we get low on the blood glucose, your muscles will turn to glycogen. So your muscles will turn to glycogen, break that glycogen back down into glucose. It can get that glycogen from the skeletal muscles or from the liver. And then after that, our muscles will go to fat. We tend to be burning a combination of all three almost always. But the shorter the duration of the activity, the more likely we are to be burning more carbohydrates. The longer duration the activity, we will be burning more fats. Okay, same slide. It's just so important. I'd like you to read it again when you're studying. Okay, where do we store these things? Well, we store glucose in the blood. But if everything is working properly, our liver is constantly metering out and making sure we have just the right amount of blood glucose. Not too much, not too little. Of course, we store glycogen in the skeletal muscle. 2/3 of all of our glycogen is stored in the skeletal muscle. And then about 1/3 is stored in the liver. Yeah. You can see the grams here. It's significant. I'm not going to ask you those grams, but those are high. Look at the skeletal muscles. At any given point in time, your skeletal muscles have about 300 to 400 grams of glycogen stored. Let me go back to the recommendations. That's more than a male or female is recommended to ingest all day. So these are substantial. It's a good thing, though. Okay. Carbohydrates are so important, right? It is what circulates in the blood, the glucose, and this is what our muscle cells will turn to immediately. So it's really important that we constantly have the right supply in the blood and then have some glycogen on the storage shelves for when we need it. Okay. All right. Speaking of, well, how on earth do we make sure that we have the right amount of blood glucose all the time? It's a really tough job for your body because things are always changing. You're getting up, you're sitting down. You're exercising, you're not exercising. You're stressed, you're not stressed. You're sleeping, you're awake. But it's not just that. There can be differences in your body's glucose needs, even if you're sitting down. You're digesting more, so we need more glucose here for this function. You haven't eaten for a while, so now we got to digest or break down more of the glycogen. Certain hormones were released that caused X or Y or Z. So even if you're not outwardly moving, the levels of glucose in the blood are always changing because your organs don't stop, right? Even if you aren't exercising, your organs are still working. So we always have to have glucose, and the amount that we need is always changing. So therefore, how we regulate that blood glucose is very important. All right. Basically, if we really simplify it, it's just like a scale. And we want the scale to be balanced. So if we have on one side our body's energy need. Whatever energy need is at a given point in time, we want to match glucose availability. If energy need increases, we also have to increase the amount of glucose that's available to the muscles. If we're sleeping and we don't need as much energy, then we need to decrease the amount of glucose available to the cells. This balance is regulated by hormones. And I'm pretty sure you've heard of these hormones, insulin, and then the opposite hormone is glucagon. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Insulin is a hormone that's released when blood glucose is too high. Insulin is a hormone that is released. It's produced in the pancreas, released from the liver. Insulin is a hormone release when blood glucose is too high. On the other hand, glucagon is the hormone that's released when blood glucose is too low. Okay, once you memorize that, then we can just talk about what they do. Well, insulin is, because it's released when blood sugar is too high, what the insulin does is it tells our liver to store more glucose. So instead of the liver letting more glucose go into the blood, the liver will pick up more glucose out of the blood and store it. So if our initial problem was too much blood glucose, insulin is released, tells the liver to pick up some of that blood glucose and store it, thereby reducing blood glucose, getting things back to normal. The opposite is true of glucagon. If you haven't eaten for a while and blood glucose is too low, we release glucagon. It goes to the liver and the skeletal muscle, and it tells them to break down glycogen into glucose. So if our initial problem is too little blood glucose, well then the release of glycogen, which is broken down back into glucose, will raise the blood sugar back up to where it needs to be. You may not be a fan of these schematics or drawings, but oftentimes they can be helpful for a reason. So here, imagine, let me go thicker. Let's go real thick here, right? This is our balance. This is what blood glucose norm is. And remember, we're talking about blood glucose, not the glucose in the muscles, not the glucose anywhere else. This is the glucose in the blood. Usually, you want this to be somewhere between 60 and 100 milligrams per section of blood. You don't have to know that number. I'm just putting it out there. Well, what happens if you just ate a bunch of pixie sticks? You know what those are? Just little straws of sugar. Well, if I eat a whole bunch of sugar, my blood glucose goes up. The body senses blood glucose has gone up, releases insulin. Insulin goes to the liver, tells it to take some of that blood glucose out of the blood and store it as glycogen, thereby reducing blood sugar back to normal. On the other hand, what if from normal I haven't eaten for a while? If I haven't eaten for a while, blood glucose will drop. The body will sense that and it will release glucagon. Glucagon goes to the liver, and it tells the liver to break down some of that glycogen back into glucose, thereby increasing blood glucose back to normal. This is a typical negative feedback loop. If there's a change from normal that's too much, our body does something to bring it back to normal. This could also be the case at rest and during exercise. At rest, typically, your blood sugar goes up. So you should know that, right? At rest is this side. At rest, your blood sugar goes up. Your muscles aren't picking it up to be used, so it just circulates in the blood. This is when insulin is more likely to be released. On the other hand, when you're exercising, blood glucose initially goes down because your muscles have all of a sudden started to soak up that blood glucose. Now, of course, we're going to talk about how and when you should replenish that blood glucose. But initially during exercise, blood glucose goes down, and therefore glucagon will be released, which helps us break down some glycogen back into glucose to bring blood glucose back up to normal. You should know these two situations. What happens, what hormone is released when we just ate or when we are at rest? And then what hormone is released when we haven't eaten for a while or just began exercising? All right. Something else to consider, in addition to simple versus complex carbs, because we're about to get into carbohydrate intake for athletes before, during, and after activity. Something else to consider is something called glycemic index. Now, admittedly, this has become a little bit out of favor, so it's not being talked about as much as it was 10, 20 years ago. There's something else coming out now, particularly for athletes, called glycemic load, which is kind of a similar idea. So feel free to look this up if you like. But for now, we're going to talk about the good old school glycemic index. Just know the definitions. A low glycemic index food causes a slower rise in blood sugar. A low glycemic index food will cause an increase in blood sugar that's slow. A low glycemic food will cause a slow increase in blood sugar. On the other hand, a high glycemic food quickly raises blood sugar. Sometimes that's good. Think about it. During activity, after you've been exercising for an hour and you've depleted your blood glucose, well, in that instance, if you're going to keep exercising and you want to bring in some carbs during activity, you'd probably want them to be high glycemic because you want the blood sugar to go up right away so you can get that fuel as soon as possible. But in everyday life, we tend to prefer low glycemic index foods that raise the blood sugar slowly. And that way we're more likely to have an even, maintained blood sugar. Because one of the potential problems with a high glycemic food is it is absorbed so quickly and it raises blood sugar so quickly that after the quick effects are gone, it could lead to an energy crash. Here is a scale. The higher the number, the higher the glycemic index, or it raises the blood sugar faster. I'm not going to ask you any of these in particular. It's just a thing for you to look at. Here is the key. When you want low, when you want moderate, and when you want high glycemic index food, you want low glycemic index food, but when you're not near an exercise session. That's an easier way to say it here. You want low glycemic index food, GI, glycemic index. You want a low glycemic index food when you're nowhere near an exercise session. Right before activity, and this would only be the case if you're doing something extremely prolonged. Half Ironman, Ironman, that might indicate that you'd want to bring in something right before. I know, like when I do the Ironman, I just finished my last one, 4, I'm done. When I've done the Ironman, I do eat something that's pretty moderate in glycemic index right before the swim. It's such a long day. I need a little boost at the beginning. And then an hour and 20 minutes later, when I get on the bike, then I'm going to start to fuel again, right? During and right after, you want high. During and initially after, we want the high to more quickly replenish our blood glucose. But later after activity, you're going to switch back to low. So the only time you want a high glycemic index food as an athlete is under certain circumstances right before and during activity. Not every athlete, but certain circumstances. All right. So here we are, the last section, but it's a pretty big section. So now we're going to take these basic principles of carbohydrates, and with the knowledge that we've already gained from previous chapters, the digestive system, energy systems, I want to talk about carbohydrates specifically as it relates to exercise. Now, this is a hard thing because, and I think you know this, I mean, every person is different, not to mention every athlete. And, sports nutrition is a young field in terms of academia. Even though we're getting much more research than we ever used to, we still don't know a lot about it. So we don't have a lot of information. We do the best we can. We're still learning. Plus, everyone is so different. Their own physiology, their own situation, different activities. So it's really hard to say this is one right thing for every athlete. But I know, because I'm this way too, it's helpful to have examples, understanding that no one's going to be exactly like everybody else. But if we can give some examples, it makes us maybe understand the concepts a little more. So that's just a long way of me introducing our 3 sample athletes. Now, I have not contacted Mia Hamm to know exactly what she eats, but I'm using her as an example of a team athlete. So here are our 3 sample athletes. Here's let me use the red again. Let's go back. Here is our high intensity strength athlete. Here is our team athlete, so soccer, basketball, something like that. And here is our endurance athlete. You can meet them. Again, I have not contacted Zydrunas, Mia, or Chris McCormack, but these are just people that exhibit the general characteristics of a high-intensity strength. This is one of the world's strongest men, a pretty high-intensity team sport. So baseball wouldn't fall under that. Golf wouldn't fall under that. But things like soccer and basketball. And then an endurance athlete, Chris McCormack. Okay, reminders. These are only suggestions because every athlete is different. It's not the same for every athlete. Okay, so for each nutrient, macronutrient, we'll talk about, for each of these athletes, what are some of the day-to-day carbohydrate considerations before exercise, during, and after. So here we see that, we remember for most everybody, somewhere between 45 and 65% of the diet should come from carbohydrates. Well, if you're an endurance athlete, you're going to be on the extreme end. So just keep that in mind. I'm never going to ask you a specific number, but if I give you examples, the endurance athlete would need the most carbohydrates. A high-intensity athlete is going to be more in the middle, and then someone who's recreational, barely exercises, or is just kind of like a weekend warrior, can still get away with being a little bit lower. Okay, so all I wanted to point out with this slide, I'm trying to be very clear about what I'd like you to know. The highest part of that range would be for our endurance athletes. Athletes overall need more carbs than non-athletes, but the highest out of all would be our endurance athletes. Okay, so I put in Chris McCormack's information into MyFitnessPal, and they recommended, so there's his info. He's older than that now, but there's his info. It's how much he weighs, how tall he is. They recommended over 4,000 calories and 600 grams of carbs. That is a lot. Pretty much nobody else is going to need that many. This is extreme endurance. I'm not going to ask you this information. I'm just giving you some examples. Okay. Now, for athletes, days before the exercise, some form of carbohydrate loading may be beneficial. May. Not every athlete needs to do this. So this is particularly effective for endurance. So this carbohydrate loading is really only applicable to endurance athletes, a marathon runner, long distance cyclist, triathlete, that's longer distance. For every other athlete, just having a good sized carbohydrate meal before is good enough, right? Mia Hamm doesn't need to carbohydrate load per se. She just wants to make sure that she has a really good, pretty high carbohydrate meal the night before. It is these extreme endurance athletes. There's been different strategies. It used to be that we would say 7 days before your Ironman, carbohydrate load all 7 days. But that was found to be too extreme. It was too much for the body to handle, and it limited your ability to get in fats and protein. Let me just check next door really quickly. Okay. Even 3 days might be a little bit much. So I would probably recommend somewhere between 1 to 3 days before activity or before the event. This isn't for every training session. Sure, if you have a longer training session, when I was doing the Ironman training, I'd go for a 6-hour bike ride. That's pretty long. So I do a little bit of carbohydrate loading the night before. But before the Ironman event itself, where I was going all out for all three, swim, bike, and run, maybe 2 or 3 days before. This doesn't mean to eat only carbs, just means to increase your carbohydrate a bit from normal. Does it work? Yes, but the science most recently tells us only 1 to 3 days before. It also used to be, by the way, that in addition to doing your carbohydrate loading a couple days before, you would before that, you would do a low carb diet. So back in the day, you'd have a 7 to 10 day period where for the first 3 low carb, you'd purposely deplete your glycogen, and then you would carbohydrate load to purposely replenish it. But we've gone away from that. Okay, here you can see some of the potential problems. I'm not going to ask you about this, but just information for you. Okay, so that was the everyday diet, and then that was kind of a couple days before. What about a couple hours before? The goal is to bring in fuel. We're about to do an activity. We better fill up the gas tank. So you want a carbohydrate-rich meal. It doesn't need to be all carbohydrates. You probably want to somewhere fit into that 50 to 65% of your meal is carbs. But you still want some fat, you still want some protein. This is really important, and I think sometimes it's not thought about enough. But of course it can be tough if you're traveling. Not everyone has resources, and we're busy, and it involves planning, so it can be hard. There's not one right amount. At this point in time, we're still hours and hours before. We still want to maintain a low glycemic index. This is not the time to pound Gatorade. Pet peeve of mine. See, now we're learning. Because if you bring in Gatorade with glucose 4 hours before an event, you're going to absorb it before you even do your event. So the window for when you'd be able to utilize that freshly brought in glucose has passed. Depending on who you are, here it says 70 to 80%. I said 50 to 65. Let's go somewhere in the middle, because it really depends on who you are. I'd say somewhere between 60 and 80%, depending on who you are. Again, the endurance athlete is going to need the highest amount of carbs. Other guidelines here. Keep in mind, when I say a carbohydrate-rich meal, there's so many options. You have to choose something that you like. You have to choose something that your body agrees with. And of course, we don't want to try something new right before the Ironman. You don't want to make a whole bunch of changes all at once. I've given you some sample meals. Everyone's different. Omelets are really good. If you like eggs, you can throw in a bunch of stuff in there. Stir fry with veggies, really good. Notice, in all of these, I have fruits and vegetables. Yeah, I know. Watch out. People tend to get the protein pretty easily. People get the grains pretty easily. Oh yeah, rice, pasta, potatoes, I got it. But we need to also make sure that we have some of the fruits and vegetables. That's going to give us the vitamins and minerals that we need. So just some food for thought. Ha, ha, ha. All right. So that was 3 to 5 hours before exercise. What about 30 to 60 minutes before exercise? Now, we're not talking about right before exercise, but 30 to 60 minutes. The goal here, half an hour to an hour before exercise, is to optimize our liver glycogen stores. Because we're getting closer to the event, we can inch up a little bit to maybe moderate glycemic index foods, small amounts. But here, we don't want to do Gatorade. We don't want to do the monosaccharide Gatorade yet. Fructose is a great thing. They've done studies, right? Fructose. And depending on what you're doing, if you're just doing a soccer game, have a couple orange slices. You don't need a whole orange. You also have to think about digestibility and comfortability. If you eat too much right before, it may feel heavy in your stomach. If it's a baseball game, not as high on the overall caloric expenditure, you don't need anything at this point in time. You can read about this. I'm not going to ask you about this, but if you were to drink that Gatorade right before, an hour before, the Gatorade would raise your blood sugar so much, so quickly, and then half an hour later, before you've even done your exercise session, you are hypoglycemic. You have a drop. So you have a rapid spike, increase in blood sugar, and then a big drop. And it could make you feel fatigued at the very time that you don't want to. So this is true, but I'm not going to ask you on an exam. Okay, I've given you some examples. Again, everyone's different. These are not high calorie values. So something else you can notice is little bits often. What about during exercise? Okay, you only need to bring in food or drink, aside from water. You only need to drink in calories. Let's say it that way, because Gatorade contains calories. The only time you need to bring in calories during exercise is if it is at least 45 to 60 minutes of continuous exercise. People sit in my classes on campus drinking Gatorade. You might as well just drink soda or a Red Bull. It's just sugar. You don't need it while you're sitting in class. But if you're exercising for a long time continuously, you'll be depleting the blood glucose. So it would be helpful, therefore, to bring in some glucose to replenish it. If you're running a 5K, whatever your 5K time is, what's my best time? 19 minutes and 16 seconds or something, right? I don't need to bring in Gatorade during that because it's not long enough for me to have depleted all of my glucose stores, my blood glucose. So I'm not anti-Gatorade. As a matter of fact, Gatorade has a pretty good osmolarity, has a good percentage of carbohydrates. But we've got to think about when you really need it. We only need it when our blood glucose levels have been pretty much gone through. And that would only happen when you're doing at least 45 to 60 minutes plus of continuous exercise. Okay, I said that already. How it works? Well, if you go through all your blood glucose, we are replenishing the blood glucose and therefore maintaining blood glucose. This is the ideal. We want to maintain the blood glucose, not let it dip too high or too low. We can also, to some degree, spare glycogen. It's good to have enough blood glucose. So you are utilizing some glycogen and some blood glucose at the same time. We don't want to go through our blood glucose so quickly that we're forced to rely only on the glycogen. Okay, but focus on the first one. Studies have been done, folks. We put people on a treadmill or a bike or whatever, and they do an hour plus of continuous activity. One person or one group drinks the Gatorade at appropriate intervals. One group or one person doesn't. In the group that did rehydrate appropriately with Gatorade, improves performance. It improves your aerobic capacity. You can produce more energy for longer. It can also increase your brain activity. Remember, glucose is your brain's only fuel source. Timing. You only need to bring in carbohydrate during exercise if you're exercising a continuous duration of 45 to 60 minutes plus. Now, this is a ballpark. For people that fall into this category, that are exercising for 45 to 60 minutes plus continuously, and they do need to bring in some Gatorade or some glucose to replenish during activity, a good ballpark figure is about 70 grams per hour. It, of course, depends who you are. That's a good ballpark. Please know that ballpark. Here are some examples of 70 grams per hour. Now, it is during activity that we want to ingest the high glycemic index. This is when we want to raise blood sugar quickly. Examples would be our monosaccharides. I'm sorry, our simple sugars. Let's just be a little bit more general. Simple sugars. This is not the time to have your potato. And it's best to have easy to ingest, liquid or gel. It just means that it takes less to digest it. And we like that. When we're exercising, we want to put as much blood and energy towards our exercise as possible, which means we want as much blood and energy to go to our muscles as possible. Any more blood flow that we have to bring to the GI tract for extra processing or digesting takes away energy from the muscles. Here are some examples of how many grams can be found in an 8-ounce bottle of Gatorade. That's pretty good, right? 56 grams in an 8-ounce bottle. What was the goal? 70 grams per hour. You can certainly go through one of those and more in an hour. You can see it's got sucrose and glucose. Sucrose, glucose, so it contains what it should. And just so you know, the appropriate percentage of carbohydrate in a sports drink is between 6 and 8% carbohydrates. It doesn't tell you that on the label, but we know this to be true. Gatorade does release this information. So you should know that range. Out of all the Gatorade, somewhere it should be between 6 and 8% carbohydrate, the rest water. Now, some people dilute their Gatorade. I'm one of them. It's just a little too sweet for me in terms of palatability and digestibility. That just means that I got to drink a little bit more of it to get the same number of carbs, simple sugars, or I need to replenish with something else in addition to. Maybe I have some little Gatorade gummies or whatever. Here's some other examples of gel. Pretty good amount of carbs. And again, it contains that simple sugar combination called maltodextrin. Okay. Things can go wrong. And, this is so personalized. Anybody who knows anything about this kind of stuff is going to tell you to practice, try it. Just like you have to practice your sport, your skills, your endurance, your power, your strength, your explosion, you also have to practice nutrition. And as I said way back when, some athletes can get away with this, particularly when you're young, particularly when the event isn't a 12-hour Ironman. But you can certainly improve your performance just by paying attention to some of this and trying. So it's really like there's an increase in performance on the table. Do you want to do a little bit extra work and get that? Because it's there for you. So things can go wrong. right? You can only absorb a certain amount so quickly. So some of the best practices would be to absorb small amounts, bring in small amounts over time. Don't drink that whole 8-ounce Gatorade at once. Small sips. It's going to be easier for your body to digest when you bring it in small sips. Those liquid, any kind of carbs, are absorbed more easily if they're ingested with water. So it's really best to have some Gatorade and water. Your gut can absorb the glucose better if it is brought in with water in addition to the Gatorade. In terms of transporting it, in addition to digesting, absorbing the glucose into the bloodstream, now you've got to transport it. There's glucose transporters that are helping the glucose travel through the bloodstream. Well, guess what? Ingesting different types of carbohydrates means that we can transport these carbs better and absorb them into the muscles better and faster. So this means you don't want to rely only on one type. Don't only have lemon lime Gatorade for the whole Ironman. Oh my God. Even if it's a shorter event, multiple types. Have a couple orange wedges and then some Gatorade. Have a Cliff Bar with maltodextrin and then also have Powerade. Okay. Here we go. Try these things in practice. Also consider the caloric need. So you want to bring in an amount of calories that's consistent with how many calories you're burning. Okay. So don't load yourself up with calories only for an hour. If you're doing an hour exercise, you don't need one whole bottle of Gatorade, 2 gels, and an orange wedge. It's too much. Here are some practical things. Our Zydrunas, our high-intensity power lifter, would only need carbohydrates if the event lasted longer than 45 minutes. But it's possible. I'm sure that these World's Strongest Men events, they do several events in one day, and there's probably a significant amount of time in between. So if you've got an event at 10 a.m. and an event at noon, it would absolutely be good to bring in a little bit of carbohydrate in between. You'd want to do maybe a monosaccharide or disaccharide, maybe a touch of the polysaccharide, right? A team sport athlete for a sport like soccer, water and a sports drink, and they're going to need a little bit more carbohydrate replenishment than the weightlifter. An Ironman athlete like this, that's pretty elite, they're going to be burning and needing to bring in, therefore, around 300 to 400 calories per hour. So it's a lot. So for these extreme endurance, like Tour de France cyclists, they're pretty much constantly eating. And it's the only way that they're able to keep putting out such a high power output. Here's an example of what Chris McCormack, he's been known for drinking inshore, which is that usually always thought of as a drink for old people, but it's actually pretty good for athletes. I don't know that I could have it during the bike ride because it's kind of dairy-like, and I think it would upset my stomach. But try different things. Okay, what about after exercise? After exercise, right after, and a little bit longer after, your goals are to just replenish the glycogen. Now think about it. During exercise, our goals were to replenish the blood glucose. During exercise, our goals were to replenish the blood glucose. After exercise, we initially are going to replenish the blood glucose, but that won't take long. Our longer term strategy after exercise is to not only replenish the blood glucose, but to also replenish the blood glycogen. It's best to begin pretty shortly after the exercise has finished. Oftentimes half an hour is a good window, so 15 minutes might be too short for your body, but definitely within a half an hour. You can see about some suggestions for how many grams of carbohydrates to bring in per minute. I'm not going to ask you those numbers because it really depends. Right after, immediately after, we want high glycemic index foods, But a little bit after that, we're going to start to transition to moderate to low glycemic index. To be honest with you, within like the first half an hour, studies have shown that ingesting other nutrients doesn't seem to benefit us. Carbohydrates should be number one. With that being said, we're still learning. I'm particularly interested in researching female athletes and transgender athletes. And for example, female athletes who have a period, the hormonal differences during their 28-day monthly cycle, there's a part of that 28-day monthly cycle where they actually need more protein than men. And they should even be ingesting some protein within a half an hour after exercising. So that's a unique thing for women during a certain part of their menstrual cycle. All right. Now, 2 hours after exercise, here's where you want to have that meal. Carbs, fats, and protein. Here's some examples for each of these athletes. I'm not going to ask you each one of these, but here you go. Okay. Focus on what was in red. I know I've given you a lot of information. I know you might want it to be more specific, but because we're all different, we have to speak in generalities, but I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Thanks, everyone.